Well, the most striking comment that Arundhati makes in her book and in her presentation, I think, is that we may be witnessing democracy's endgame. That sounds kind of apocalyptic, but it's not an unusual statement, in fact. In fact, one hears things pretty much like that right in the mainstream. So, for example, the chief financial officer of the Bank of England, who's in charge of financial stability, says that the financial system is entering into what he calls a doom loop. We're just going to keep getting worse and worse crises. There's nothing we can do about it. Former chief economist of the IMF, who's Sloan School here, Simon Johnson, describes it as a Doomsday Cycle. And I won't go into the details, but there's two basic issues. One of them is a fundamental market inefficiency, which everybody should know about. When you enter into a transaction in a market system, you consider your own benefit. You try to work it out so it comes out well for you, but you don't consider the effects on others. That does not enter into calculation. That's what's called an externality. You have it in a footnote. So, for example, if Goldman Sachs sells, complex financial instruments, which it knows are no good, it will insure itself against loss by betting that they'll fail. It's part of the background of the current crisis, but it will not take into account what's called systemic risk, the effect on the whole system if its transactions go bad. And that's another externality, and that could be huge. And in addition to that, there are what are called perverse incentives. The power of the financial institutions over the state is so enormous. That's a change from in the last 30 years, and by now financial institutions account for about almost a third of corporate profits. 40 years ago, it was a few percent. Shifted from a manufacturing economy to a financial economy with all kinds of consequences. But one effect is that they have such enormous power over the state that there are all kinds of guarantees that if anything goes wrong, they'll have no problem. The most famous of them is the government insurance policy called too big to fail. If you're too big, taxpayer will bail you out. So a combination of market inefficiencies and perverse incentives, of which that's only one, virtually guarantee a doomsday cycle. You keep getting into deeper and deeper trouble. Bigger and bigger crises have been coming along regularly since the financialization of the economy, and things are now set up so they'll get worse. Well, that's a doomsday cycle, a doom loop, circular. You have a way of getting out of it. But the same logic pretty much applies in cases where you're not going to get out of it. One striking case of it has to do with the environmental crisis. So as soon as by about a year ago, the insurance industry was already exulting that they had defeated any possibility of health reform. In fact, Business Week had a front cover story. Front page said, insurance companies celebrate victory in health reform. And other industries had their eyes on it. Very shortly after that, the American Petroleum Institute announced very publicly, I could read it in the New York Times, that they were going to follow the same techniques that the insurance companies use to concoct opposition to the to any health reform, which allowed them, in fact, to defeat it, so that essentially nothing came out. And they were going to do the same thing on any energy bill. And the Chamber of Commerce, the big business lobby, came along and said, yeah, we're going to do the same thing. And in fact, they were already involved, and they expanded a great propaganda campaign, which is to try to convince people that climate change is just a liberal hoax. There's nothing to it. And it's very effective. In the last year, the percentage of Americans who think that it's a serious issue has dropped very sharply. And by now, barely a third of Americans believe in anthropogenic climate change, that there's some human impact on climate change. There's a recent book that I just received from a friend in Australia, an Australian political economist. The title is Requiem for the Species. Well, that's what he's describing. If that works, it's Requiem for the Species. Now, what's interesting is that these CEOs who are running these campaigns have the same beliefs about anthropogenic climate change that we have. I mean, they know perfectly well that, sure, it's not a liberal hoax, it's real, it's ominous, it's going to destroy everything they own, it's going to destroy the lives of their grandchildren and so on. But at the same time, they're carrying out the campaign to ensure that it takes place. Now, that sounds kind of contradictory until you recognize that it really has the same logic as the financial crisis. These are institutional facts. In their role as human beings, they may care about the future of the species or their grandchildren. In their role as managers of corporations, they don't, and they can't, just as in the case of the financial crisis. It's an institutional fact that you have to, in a market system, you have to maximize profit and market share. In fact, it's a legal requirement. So if they did anything else, it would be criminal. And you have to, from their point of view, they have to carry out a process that Orwell called doublethink. Have two contradictory ideas in mind and believe them both. That's almost a motto for the intellectual culture. And in the case of the financial crisis, well, okay, it gets you into a loop, a worse and worse doom loop. It gets worse and worse, but there are ways of pulling out. In the case of the climate crisis, it doesn't. It gets you into a descending spiral. There's no loop. But again, these are institutional facts. You can't blame the people who make these decisions. If they don't make them, they're out, and somebody else is in who does make them. And in fact, as I said, it's even a legal requirement. So they're kind of institutional structures, and they do guarantee kind of an end game. Of course, there are answers, but the answers require real functioning democracy, not the kind of democracy that exists, in which just to quote what should be a truism, that dangerous radical Adam Smith in 1776 commented that he was talking about England, but it generalizes to everything. He said that in England, the people who own the society make the decisions. In his words, the merchants and manufacturers are the principal architects of policy, and they make sure that their own interests are well attended to, no matter how grievous the effects on others, including the people of England, or even worse, the victims of the savage injustice of the Europeans. He was speaking particularly of the British in India. It's kind of an old-fashioned conservative who had moral values, long gone. But these ought to be truisms, and yes, now it's not the merchants and manufacturers, it's financial institutions and multinational corporations, and they're going to ensure that their own interests are the most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the effect on others, including, for example, the fate of the species. Now, there's no time to talk about it, but pretty much the same holds in the case of the other major threat to survival, namely nuclear weapons. Markets and market democracies, kind that function, like Arundhati said. I'm not talking about some ideal, but what functions are theoretic. Both markets and democracies are based on, in principle, on availability of information. You have to know what's happening, otherwise you can't make rational decisions. And there are institutional pressures which prevent that from happening. That's another story, but in the case of nuclear weapons, or the what's considered the current major threat, Iran, the fact of the matter is very few people know the facts. And you can't find them out without a research project. And the facts are very ugly and serious. And that, again, is an institutional fact, has to do with the principal architects of power and their control over the institutions in which we exist. So talking about democracy's endgame is by no means an outlandish idea. We're kind of living it for reasons which are inherent in the institutions in which we're embedded.